his ministry, Jesus asked many different questions. One of these questions was, where is your faith? One of the great heroes of faith in evangelical Christianity was a man born on the 27th of September 1805 in Germany. As a young man growing up, he had the history of being a thief and had spent time in jail. But through personal evangelism, he had been converted, and his faith grew as he attended a Bible study. His name was George Muller. Muller came to London in 1829, and he married Mary Groves, who was in fact the sister to the very famous Anthony Norris Groves, who was one of the founders of the Brethren Faith Missionary movement. Muller was inspired by the life of Anthony Norris Groves, who sold all his possessions that he might become a faith missionary. George Muller had a vision and a burden to reach out and rescue orphans. And of course, at the time, 1835, the living conditions for orphans was dreadful. Charles Dickens, the famous author, in his writings reflects some of the awful situations the orphans had to endure. Muller commenced an orphanage in 1835. He began with 30 little girls in Bristol, and that orphanage grew until eventually he was caring for 2,000 children. He looked to God in faith for all the provisions that he needed to provide food, clothing, education, shelter. What remarkable faith George Muller had. My message today is based on Jesus' question in Luke chapter 8, verse 25. Where is your faith? So let's take a moment to read the context of that passage in Luke chapter 8. One day, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's cross to the other side of the lake." So they got into a boat and started out. As they sailed across, Jesus settled down for a nap. But soon a fierce storm came down on the lake. The boat was filling with water, and they were in real danger. The disciples went and woke him, shouting, "Master, Master, we're going to drown." When Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and the raging waves. Suddenly, the storm stopped and all was calm. Then he asked them, "Where is your faith?" The disciples were terrified and amazed. "Who is this man?" they asked each other. "When he gives a command, even the wind and the waves obey him." Was this a searching question that Jesus asked the disciples? Or was it a veiled rebuke by Jesus for their lack of faith? The context, of course, of the question comes when a fierce storm so severe had come down upon the disciples, and they thought they were going to drown in the Sea of Galilee. My message today is built on 3 simple points. I want to speak on the risk of losing faith. Secondly, on the rebuking of the waves. And thirdly, the restoring of lasting faith. So let's deal with the risk of losing faith. It was, from the passage that we read, the intention of Jesus to undertake this sea journey. It was his initiative to cross over to the other side of the lake. The Sea of Galilee was notorious for sudden and unexpected storms, due of course to the fact that the lake was surrounded by hills, where in the contour of these hills there were gaps, And at times the wind would come searing through these gaps, and in no time at all a storm would arise. Actually, recently, a £14 million yacht was caught in a storm off the coast of Sicily, and in 16 minutes it sank with a loss of 7 lives tragically. A reminder of the power of the wind and the sea. Some of the disciples on board that day were experienced fishermen, and they must have known about the possibility of these storms and no doubt had sailed through them many times. However, in this instance, it must have been a very fierce storm to have unnerved and panicked these disciples. Jesus, on the journey, had taken the opportunity to rest and sleep until he was rudely awakened by terrified disciples. We note it wasn't the storm that awakened Jesus or disturbed him. It was the disciples. They thought the risk of drowning was high and even questioned Jesus' care when they said, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?" In the sea of life, there are many storms that come into all our circumstances. Like the disciples, we're prone to panic and even question if the Lord cares for us. Perhaps when there's a threat to our health and we hear the solemn words of a doctor when he's giving a serious diagnosis. Do we run the risk of losing faith when family relationships hit a storm? Because I spoke recently to a young woman whose husband walked out on her and the family suddenly. She has been so hurt, so deeply, she hasn't been back to church since. And so the storm of family relationships can be fierce. We might also find ourselves in the storm of financial difficulties. In the West, in these days, we are going through a cost of living crisis so severe that it affects people's everyday life. In Africa, particularly in Zambia, the failure of the rains this year has caused severe drought, and many believers and missionaries are suffering with high living expenses and, of course, the risk of losing faith. Let's consider now the rebuking of the waves. This storm, I'm suggesting, was caused by Satan. It was, on his part, an attempt to drown Jesus. The reason that I believe Satan was behind the storm is that the word that the Lord Jesus uses for rebuke in rebuking the wind is the same word that he used to rebuke the evil spirit in a boy who was demon possessed. Of course, Satan is not always the cause of storms. Sometimes the Lord allows difficult circumstances to test our faith. The power of Jesus is such that he is in control and he preserves the disciples from drowning. It was Jesus that had said at the very beginning, "Let us cross over to the other side of the lake." It was his intention to reach there. So we needn't fear or be alarmed that we won't reach where Jesus is planning for us to go. On the journey of life, it is not plain sailing. But with Jesus on board, we will arrive at our destination. I'm indebted to a friend who once gave me this quote: "The waves may be over your head, but they're under his feet." The waves may be over your head, but they are under his feet. So thirdly, the restoring of lasting faith. To diverge for a moment, there's a beautiful pastoral touch from Jesus to Peter in Luke 22, verses 31 and 32. Jesus said, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift each of you like wheat, but I have pleaded in prayer for you, Simon, that your faith should not fail." I somehow think there was a gentleness and a care in the very voice of Jesus when he spoke these words. With Jesus, failure is never final. In the first moments of the calm on the Sea of Galilee, the disciples were no doubt exhausted and relieved. And then Jesus posed his question, "Where is your faith?" By his presence with them and with his power, he restored their faith in him. When they said, "Who is this man? What manner of man is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Could it be that I'm speaking to someone today and for some reason you've lost your faith? Or life has become difficult and you're at the risk of losing your faith. Can I encourage you with all the compassion that's in my heart? Don't give up. Don't leave your faith. Remember the words of Hebrews 11, verse 27. It was by faith that Moses left the land of Egypt. He kept right on going because he kept his eyes on the one who is invisible. My departed friend George Verver often concluded his emails with the encouragement, "Keep on, keeping on." That's the theme. Can you hear and answer the question that Jesus asks? Where is your faith? Reflecting on that question to me and to Kathy, it's very relevant. Kathy and I have been going through a major storm, particularly in regards to Kathy's health, where she's been suffering severe pain from arthritis in her hip. So 3 weeks ago we attended hospital and a consultant confirmed it was arthritis in the hip, and the only solution was to have a hip replacement. He indicated it might take 6 to 9 months to be on the waiting list before such an operation could take place. I prayed and we prayed, but in our hearts we lacked the faith to believe that somehow the Lord could intervene and reduce this waiting list. Where is your faith? Came to me constantly, and I faced up to it. And only yesterday, while preparing for this message, a call came from the hospital to say that a date had been arranged for Kathy's operation for her hip replacement, and it's to be on the 24th of October. Wonderful answer to prayer, even though our faith was so weak. Let me conclude this little message with a quote from George Mueller. He said, "The beginning of anxiety is the end of faith, and the beginning of true faith is the end of anxiety." Thanks for listening.